Hello everyone, welcome to Indian Economy by Aman Soni. In today's news, sir, shall be discussing the important articles related to economy from the Hindu newspaper. In the editorial page, this editorial discusses about the World Bank report on India's GDP projection, what are the impacts, and what should India be doing. In yesterday's news, sir, we have already covered the article. This is just a repetition of it, so we'll skip it. There are various concepts in this article, so let's go through the article. Is the Reserve Bank doing enough to control the inflation? We know that in India, the inflation is mainly measured through the CPI, and RBI has an upper tolerance limit of 6% to control the inflation. And in the recent monetary policy committee review meeting, RBI said that now slowly they are moving away from accommodation. Even though the official stance is accommodative stance, they have said that they are moving away from accommodative stance and growing towards controlling the inflation. In this context, the question arises that is the RBI behind the curve in controlling the inflation? Is the RBI late in taking the steps? The main mandate of RBI is to have price stability in the economy. And one side the inflation is increasing, and that is majorly because the geopolitical uncertainty, increase in the crude oil prices. Now because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, increase in the edible oil prices, increase in the commodity prices, and the global chip supply chain disruptions, shipping container shortage. If you look at it, all these factors are supply chain disruptions. They are supply chain constraints. And we also have demand side constraint wherein the rural demand is low. So because of major supply chain factors and also few demand side factors, the entire growth of the economy is getting disrupted. So the authors say that at this situation, just fiddling with the repo rate, just playing with the repo rate won't help it. Because monetary policy is complex, everything is related in economy. For example, if you look at inflation, growth, jobs in the economy, the external balance, foreign exchange, and overall financial stability, everything is related to every other thing, and it is a web of interaction. So everything will have an impact on every other thing. Inflation will have an impact on growth, jobs, and financial stability. The growth is directly influenced by inflation. The growth would impact the jobs, and the level of growth and inflation and jobs in the economy would determine our foreign exchange reserves, and everything put together will determine the financial stability. So everything is related. Fiddling with each of it will have an overall impact on the economy, and we cannot exactly predict what the impact is going to be because there are various complex factors involved. And if the RBI thinks that just by fiddling with the inflation and the repo rate in a linear fashion, that is the traditional knowledge wherein you increase the or decrease the repo rate to control the money supply, it won't have much impact. And the authors give few reasons to say that the RBI has been lagging in taking the steps. For example, RBI expected the inflation in February monetary policy to be around 4.5%, but now it has revised its estimate to 5.7%. So you can see the gap in the estimates. And one factor which we can discuss here is when the RBI's old monetary policy estimate came, at that time the Russia-Ukraine conflict was not happening. So maybe that's why RBI was not able to predict it properly. That time the only problem was the USA central bank's interest rate increase and the increasing oil prices. So because RBI was not able to factor in the impact of Russia-Ukraine conflict, the difference in the inflation arises. And the other aspect is regarding the household inflation expectations. What the household survey expectation is going to be will be totally different from what the reality of the inflation is going to be, because expectations of something in the future, the forecast, is always going to be different from the what the reality turns out to be. So the expectation survey of consumer confidence will have certain limitations. And the other aspect being the deposit rate, which is also reducing. And RBI as a positive thing, wherein the central bank in the USA, we saw in the previous month, stopped purchasing the bond prices and the yields got affected, but RBI stopped the bond purchases in October itself. So in that aspect, RBI was way ahead than all its peer central banks. And the traditional economics says that again, if there is a fall in the growth, you go for easy monetary policy, easy fiscal policy, so that the growth in the economy kickstarts, and so that the downward cycle of the growth will pick up again and the growth would increase. But if the drop in the GDP is not because of cyclical reasons, and there is a permanent scar in the GDP, that is, if the GDP has fallen not because of cyclic reasons but because of various factors like the pandemic, like the Russia Ukraine conflict, increasing oil prices, increasing inflation, reduction in consumer demand, all this would permanently impact the GDP, wherein it falls below the level where it can pick up like a cyclical policy, then going through the traditional knowledge of just easy monetary policy won't be enough, because you'll have to take additional steps because the growth has fallen further down your expectation level. It has fallen to a level where it cannot recover by itself. The traditional theories would fail here. And because of all this, the fiscal deficit is going to be increased because the government has to subsidize the LPG for the increased prices, and the current account deficit would increase and the fiscal deficit would also increase. But if the government invests the amount into capital spending, then that would lead to crowding in of the private investments. That way, both the capital increase expenditure and the private increase expenditure because of the crowding in would revive the demand in the economy. It would have been easy to control the inflation through repo rates if the inflation would is just because of the oil prices. Now it's not the same. Now there is an edible oil issue, there are fertilizers, chemicals, feedstock, all round supply chain disruptions, and adding to that, we are seeing how the food price inflation is increasing, which would impact the vulnerable section more. And technically, if you have seen, 2 years have gone by in the COVID pandemic without the real growth in the economy. And having high inflation on one side and having zero growth will be a disaster to the economy. It can lead to a place of stagflation, wherein on one side we have stagnation of the economy and then we have increasing inflation that would lead to increase in unemployment because there is no growth happening but the inflation is increasing. So it will lead to increase in unemployment, and it would lead to further vicious cycle in the demand, and the entire growth in the economy would fall in the future if not revived. And because of the global slowdown, because of the oil prices and the Russia Ukraine conflict and all the macroeconomic factors, the exports also would impact because the entire economy of the world will slow down, so the exports also won't pick up that much. So what should be done to control the inflation? The traditional theory says that we should tighten the liquidity by increasing the repo rate to control the inflation. But that would have made sense where is the lot of credit growth. If we have around 25 to 30% of credit growth in the economy, then if we increase the repo rate, the cost of borrowing, the interest rates would increase. So if the individual retail consumers and the corporates feel that the cost of borrowing is high, then they would stop borrowing. That way the money supply in the economy will reduce. But now we have around credit growth of only 5%. So even when we are playing with the repo rate, it won't have much impact on the economy because there are no people who are taking the loans. Only when people are ready to take the loans, and if you increase the inflation rate, then people will be discouraged to take the loans and the money supply will be curtailed. But here people are not taking the loans itself. There is no credit growth happening. At that point of time, going for the strategy of playing with the repo rates will not have much impact because the credit growth is around just 5%. And the other crucial factor is market sentiment. If the producers and the consumers feel that there's going to be a growth in the economy, then they would be ready to consume and there would be consumer demand. If everyone feels that the economy is going to be uncertain in the future, then they would save the money, they would not invest the money, and even the producers are not going to produce the goods because they would want to save the working capital. And the market sentiment is also a crucial factor in driving the growth in the economy. And RBI has to bring back credibility in the economy that everything is going to be fine, there's not going to be economic disaster, and that it can do that by controlling the inflation, by focusing on controlling the inflation now, which is what exactly RBI is doing by saying that they are moving from the accommodative stance to the controlling of inflation. And the article also discusses about, is the CPI a proper measure to control the inflation? Do we get proper results by having CPI inflation measure? So there is reason for the divergence between WPI and CPI. The major reasons being, CPI is a retail price index, WPI is a wholesale price index. Here both goods and services will be measured. Here just the goods would be measured, so there is the difference in the aspect of service. And when it comes to changes in the supply side, for example increase in the oil prices, because the WPI is closer to the production level, the changes in oil prices would get immediately impact would be shown immediately in the WPI, because it is at the wholesale price level, because the changes in oil prices would first impact the wholesaler, and when the wholesaler and the goods pass on to the retail level, only then the CPI can manufacture the changes. So in order for the change in goods and petrol, diesel, the input cost changes to be reflected in WPI CPI, it will take around 1 month to 1.5 months depending on the supply chain of the particular good. And there is again the aspect of taxes. Here the taxes are not included. Here in CPI the taxes are measured, because of which we have a divergence between WPI and CPI. And another aspect is, if we are going for high credit infusion without there is proper growth in the economy, we are just giving loans but there is no real growth happening, then the businesses which take the loan would go into loss, because the demand is not there, the sale is not happening, and they will incur losses. So it would just lead to increase in the NPAs. So we have to make sure that before we are infusing the credit, there is going to be a demand, the consumption demand also in the economy, because here from the supply side we are increasing the credit and we are pushing to the production of goods, and if there is equivalent demand side, then the supply side and demand side would match, otherwise there is going no demand will be there and the NPS would increase in the economy. And the economists Kaushik Basu and the Nobel laureate Abhijit Banerjee, they have said that we have to go for monetization of deficit. Monetization of deficit is where the central bank purchases the bonds from the government to meet the borrowing needs of the government. That is monetization of deficit. And the economists also say that instead of measuring CPI, WPI, core inflation, we have to look at the employment, because employment in an economy is what shows the reality. All these inflations are based on the expectations, they are based on certain assumptions of statistics, they are based on certain sample space, the products that are involved, the people that are surveyed, but employment is the real measure. What is happening on the ground, that is measured by the employment rate, that has to be looked at, because they say that ultimately the CPI and WPI, they are about the expectations, they are about the forecast, and people could go wrong in expecting something about the future, but we have to look at the real numbers on the economy, and that is shown by the employment rate. In the explainer page, there is an article about the sovereign debt crisis in Sri Lanka. Yesterday's news we have read that the Sri Lankan government has defaulted on the sovereign bonds, and we'll discuss what are the sovereign bonds and what is going to be the impact. Sovereign debt. Sovereign is something related to the state, something related to a nation. So the debt which is raised by a sovereign nation, the government of a nation, is known as sovereign debt. So generally what the governments would do, they would continuously would be raising money in order to finance social security schemes, in order to finance the deficit in the budgets. So they would be paying the interest and they would go for re-rolling the loans, renewing the loans. So they would take fresh loans to repay the old debt, and this cycle would keep happening. They would take a loan to repay the old loan, they would again take a loan to repay the old loan, and they would also be paying interest rate. So this thing would be going on as long as you're paying the interest rates. But here, because of the foreign exchange crisis, Sri Lanka is not able to pay the interest rate, and it has also defaulted on the loan. Now countries, when they are borrowing, they can either borrow in their local currency or they can borrow in their foreign exchange currency. The benefit of borrowing in local currency is that whenever you raise debt in local currency, you would be able to repay the debt because you have that money and you have your central bank who can print the money for you when you want to repay the debt. But the challenge here is that why would someone would be giving you money in the local rupee when your economy is not performing well? For example, if Sri Lanka has to raise money in the Sri Lankan rupees, why would an investor sitting in America or Europe, he would want to be investing in the Sri Lankan rupees? For safety reasons, for his own sake, when he wants to take back the money, he would want it in US dollars. So that's why he would probably invest more in US dollars than in the Sri Lankan rupee. So here we can understand that in order to raise the debt in your local currency, your economy has to be performing well and you have to have good credit rating. And the other aspect is raising money in foreign currency. Generally the debt would be raised in US dollars world over. So when you are raising the money in US dollars, there is always a risk that you might not have enough US dollars to pay back the debt. You have to earn US dollar exchange to pay back the debt. You can't print US dollars. Your Sri Lankan bank can't print US dollars. So you have to earn the foreign exchange through exports, through tourism, through getting remittances to the domestic economy from the foreign nations. But Sri Lanka being a majorly tourism sector, we discussed about how various factors led to the crisis in Sri Lanka. Now Sri Lanka is not able to pay the foreign debt and it has defaulted on the debt. So what is going to be the impact of defaulting on the debt? Just like an individual, when you default a debt with a bank, you would be declared a defaulter and next time you won't get a loan because the banks know that now you are going to default on the loan. You are not someone who is going to pay back the loan, so nobody would be ready to give you the loan. Now same happens to a sovereign nation also. When you default on the sovereign loan, next time the lenders won't be ready to give you the loan. Your credit ratings would fall. Now because your ratings have fallen, next time you want to raise the loan, you would have to pay a higher interest rate because the risk for the lender is increasing. Your ratings are low, that means you have high risk to invest into your country, so the lender would want higher interest rate. For example, India has higher rating rate compared to Sri Lanka. So if both India and Sri Lanka goes to the US market to raise the debt, who would be the investors willing to invest? Obviously India, because it has more rating compared to Sri Lanka. But they would be ready to invest in Sri Lanka when Sri Lanka is paying extra interest rate than what India is paying. In order to compensate for the extra risk taken by the investor, Sri Lanka would now have to pay extra interest rate. So the cost of borrowing for Sri Lanka in future, it's going to be higher because the credit ratings have fallen. And when it goes to IMF for any loan now, which it is planning to go, IMF would put more conditionalities. It would say reduce the taxes, put a ban on the organic farming, because all these factors led to the current crisis. And IMF would also ask it to sell the public sector undertakings which are making losses, privatize them, and remove all the restrictions and controls that Sri Lanka has put on foreign exchange. So because now IMF has the borrowing power, it has the power on Sri Lanka, because now Sri Lanka is going to IMF for loan and it has defaulted on the loan. So IMF is on a stronger position now. It would put conditionalities on Sri Lanka now. Here in business page, just look at the heading, government capital expenditure to increase jobs and manufacturing. Obviously when the government increases the capital expenditure, it would lead to creation of jobs because the government would invest in various capital expenditure projects like roads, infrastructure. It would lead to increase in jobs for the private contractors, because of which, in order to increase their capacity, the private contractors also would invest in their businesses. In order to get a contract of government, you need to bid. Once you have put in for the bid and you have won the bid, in order to accomplish the huge product, if your business size is not enough, you will also have to invest in your own business to increase the capacity of the business. So that way, if the government invests in capital expenditure, it would lead to crowding in of the private investors. Investors also would invest into the economy. So it would be a win-win situation wherein the government expenditure is increasing, the private expenditure is increasing. So both will lead to increase in the jobs in the economy. So it would have a positive impact, ultimate positive impact on the entire growth of the economy. Now all these articles can be skipped. Here just read the headlines. Nothing important to go through the details. These are the articles related to economy today. Thank you so much.